Good afternoon and welcome to today's Adweek webinar. Is your brand agency relationship complicated? And we'll be sharing 5 ways to work together and keep that brand agency love alive. I'm Stuart File, Custom Publishing Director of Adweek, and I will be your host for today's event. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few logistics, and then we'll pass it on over to today's speaker. In terms of timing, the actual presentation will go about 35-40 minutes. Afterwards, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A with our speaker. So if you have a question, please just use the Q&A widget down there at the bottom of your On24 console. We'll get the questions and we will answer as many as we can. If we don't get to your question, we always make sure that the speaker receive them so they will have a chance to get back to you offline. We will be social sharing for today's webinar. You'll notice there's a hashtag. It's a hashtag #CreateBetter. So if you're going to be tweeting anything out, please use that hashtag. We'll be tweeting out a bunch of the slides from the Adweek Webinars Twitter feed. You'll see it there on your screen. That's the @AW Webinars. So go ahead, go out on Twitter, give us a shout out, let us know you're in the room and you are enjoying today's webinar. If you'd like to invite a colleague to today's webinar, there's another widget. It is down there on the bottom of your screen. Looks like a paper airplane. That will open up a pre-populated email with a link over to the registration page. So alert your colleagues, invite them to join us. If they can't make it live, they can certainly come and listen to the recording. Today's webinar obviously is being recorded and will be available on demand probably about 2 hours after the end of today's webinar. We will be sending out notification letting people know when the on-demand version is out there. Want to point out one other feature, and that is the resource list. And you'll find that's a green button down on the bottom of your screen. In there you'll find a copy of today's slide deck, so you can have that to share with your colleagues, a link to the Adweek Webinars page, and a link over to our sponsor, Hightail. And so you'll be able to see their homepage. They've also very kindly shared 3 resources that they think that you guys and our audience will be interested in. So feel free to go on over and take a look at those once the webinar is done, so you can be, of course, paying attention to our speaker today. Let me introduce our speaker. We will be joined today by Mike Trigg. Mike is the Chief Operating Officer, the COO of Hightail, and he's a guy who really believes that improving collaboration can free the world's creativity. I'm not going to say much more than that before. Let me just pass it on over to Mike, and he will tell us about what he feels about collaboration, creativity, and the brand agency relationship. All yours, Mike.
Great. Thanks, Stuart. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Stuart mentioned, I'm the COO at Hightail, but I've actually spent most of my career in a wide variety of other capacities. I've done a lot of marketing roles. I've hired and fired a lot of agencies and contractors and freelancers. I've also been on the agency side and been a consultant and advisor myself. So I know both sides of what can often be a complicated relationship. And I think a major reason that it is complicated is because what we're doing is complicated. We as marketers, we as advertisers, branders, creative people, those who haven't lived their career in marketing and creative professions often have kind of a misguided perception about the marketing function, that it's this discrete department that just cranks out content effortlessly. And the reality is much different. Most marketing departments are really a constellation of individuals and agencies because there's such a wide variety of stuff that you need to work on, from web design to e-commerce, TV ads to newsprint, online advertising, SEM. All these areas require specific expertise, specific creative expertise oftentimes. And the marketers job, and particularly the CMO's job, becomes really complicated, managing all the efforts across all these different functions and people. As a CMO myself, I often feel that I liken it to a swarm of bees. There's a ton of activity, but it can be a little hard sometimes to know what all is being done, what's going on, which projects are on time, which ones are in trouble, how you're allocating resources across that whole extended organization, and ensuring that you've got good communication, good collaboration among that group can be a real headache. At Hightail, we commissioned a survey on this question of how the creative process is managed and some of the challenges that are involved in that. And it's a major pain point for people. About a third of the 500 or so creative and marketing people that we surveyed said that they'd had a project go late or over budget in the last year. And some research from IBM showed that it was that this can result in very high failure rates of projects, creative projects in particular. 60% don't meet their objectives. About 44% in their survey were delivered late or over budget or incomplete. And nearly a quarter of creative projects failed entirely and were canceled or abandoned. So it's a real problem, and the client-agency relationship is often at the fault line of those dysfunctions, and frankly sometimes can be blamed for, fairly or not, some of the disconnects that happen and cause projects to go awry. So we kind of looked at this and, again, have studied it and organized some thoughts from both our experiences here as a marketing organization at Hightail, but we also work with a number of huge ad agencies and global brands to kind of get their input on what some of the challenges are in getting that brand agency relationship right are. So one big problem that, not surprisingly, comes up in a lot of organizations and postmortems of brand agency relationships that went awry is miscommunication. In that same survey I mentioned earlier, a lot of people, a lot of creative teams report that they use email for managing their creative projects, in particular for getting feedback on their creative assets. But if you ask them if they think email is a very good tool for this, only about 30% think it's effective. The majority think it probably isn't very good, and a number of them, 5%, think it's completely ineffective. And that, to me, is somewhat of a non-surprising result. If I think about my personal inbox, oftentimes is jammed with stuff. It's very hard to context switch from project to project, asset to asset. Individual creatives who are working on one particular deliverable for an extended period of time are so immersed in that they don't necessarily realize that the person that they're trying to get review or feedback or approval from may have an inbox that looks more like a dumpster fire, where there's a bunch of things piled in there. By the time I get to my inbox at the end of the day, it might be easy to lose an approval or a review or something else that's on deadline, and I hate being the bottleneck for things. So often then what happens is, well, let's set up a meeting, or let's set up, or let's instant message each other on HipChat or Slack or Skype or something like that. And all these things can create a bit of a firestorm of communication, and the end result is that a lot of the discussions that transpire across all these different platforms get fragmented and spread across, are very hard to follow and keep in one place. So, miscommunication, I think, is fairly easy to diagnose, but some of the things that we've seen are where there's sort of cross-organizational barriers can be a real challenge, and obviously that's the case when there's an agency that's brought into a project. Just making sure that both the in-house and the outside shops have equal access to information is very important. The fact that communication can be fractured across multiple systems and oftentimes disjointed from the particular creative asset that's being developed is a huge problem. So if you got a bunch of instant messages in Slack, but that asset isn't in Slack, that is a huge challenge to communication, because it can be unclear what you're even talking about. And then transparency. A lot of organizations manage their teams with a little bit of a lack of transparency. I think that can be sometimes start with good intentions of what's communicated and what's not across that client agency threshold. But I think the most effective teams have good, transparent communication across that organizational boundary. So a second big area that can cause these creative projects to go awry and the client-agency relationship to get strained is misalignment. I found an interesting survey that Fastco Create did that looked at how clients and agencies responded to different questions. So can I speak my mind freely? Clients certainly felt they could. Agencies, fewer than half of on the agency side felt they could speak their mind freely, particularly with their client. Understand how to drive sales. Agencies think they're great at it. Clients, not so much. Don't necessarily feel like their agencies have that key objective in mind. Understanding the client's business, the agencies give themselves more credit here than the clients do in terms of the ins and outs of what drives the business, the competitive landscape, positioning, those sorts of things. And then most importantly, are you good at demonstrating ROI? Agencies thought, more than 70% thought they were good at that. Only about 40% of clients felt their agencies, agreed that their agencies did a good job of demonstrating ROI in their projects. And obviously, for a head of marketing or head of creative, that's the bar that they ultimately get measured by. And so misalignment on goals within a creative project can be a major strain on that client-agency relationship. And, again, here I think it manifests itself in a couple different ways, this broader symptom does. A big one is just differing creative visions. I know, speaking for myself, some of the creative projects that I've worked on that have kind of, ended badly for the agency, there was just a misalignment up front on what the creative vision would be, and as the project got underway, the deliverable became clear that the deliverable wasn't really on track for what we had in mind or what we'd hired the agency to do. Unclear business objectives is a big one. Making sure that the agency, as they kick off the work, understands why is this being commissioned? What are we trying to do? And then ultimately, what is the success criteria? How is this asset or the campaign that this asset rolls up to going to be judged by? Are we trying to win awards, or are we trying to move the needle on some KPI within the organization? So I think getting alignment early on in a project is really important. We'll talk a little bit later in the session about some tips for that. And then a third big area that is attributable for projects failing is poor process. Our survey asked creatives how effective is their current creative process, and only about 25% feel they have an effective creative process. A lot feel like it really could be improved, and a lot follow, by their own admission, what could be described as sort of an ad hoc creative process. And some of that is just the very nature of creative projects. It's hard to know sometimes at the outset of a project exactly how it's going to go, what rounds of revisions are going to be needed, et cetera. But this can be, a real challenge and can get projects off on the wrong foot. A lot of people reported poor project management. 34% said that was a cause for projects running, late or over budget. But other challenges as well: unclear client feedback, inefficient review process, unclear approval process. The approval process in particular was an area that we drilled down on in our survey and asked folks if getting final approval on projects is an issue. And 86% felt that was an area that they could improve upon. This can be a real challenge, getting not only the final approval, but getting approvals at each of the milestones and phases of a project can be a big obstacle. Sometimes there's ambiguity about exactly who needs to be providing approval. That is a real challenge. Sometimes I think the process of providing feedback is a little bit too unstructured. I always describe this as, a piece of creative being thrown over the wall and basically asks, what do you think? And that can be a recipe for disaster because it leaves the reviewers unsure what they should be providing feedback on. And so I think providing a little structure and guidance is really important. Having clear milestones in your process is always really critically important, and kind of consequences for missing those milestones in terms of overall project delay. Frequently, reviewers and approvers can be the bottlenecks themselves and the cause of a project running late. And so having good sort of polite but persistent reminders to get those approvals done, get those reviews done, and keep the project moving forward is really critical. So, enough of the problems. Let's get on to some of the solutions. So we put together these 5 tips for a successful brand agency relationship. And I've actually authored a blog post on this subject as well to just provide a point of view, mostly from the client side on what makes for an effective relationship. But these are organized around several areas and phases of a project, and have been structured for the client side, the agency side, and then what both sides can do together to help improve their relationship and their collaboration. So might as well start where most creative projects begin, which is inspiration. Coming up with the idea for a campaign or for an asset is really the first critical part of any project and getting it off on the right foot. Some of the things that we've found really effective on the client side at Hightail when we work with agencies is to put a lot of thought into the creative brief. Sometimes this can feel like busy work and sort of formal, especially for projects that are trying to move quickly ahead. But we find this is a really useful process, not only for communicating to the agency what we want, but for organizing our own thoughts about what's important and why we're even kicking this off. On the agency side, an effective tool I've seen is I call cross-pollination. So frequently, agency teams can suffer from the same myopia as their clients if they've got dedicated account teams that only work on certain brands. But the beauty of an agency is you work on multiple projects. And so some of the most creative ideas that I've seen come out of agency is when they pull in different people from different accounts, different industries even, to get their ideas and feedback on in the ideation phase. And then together, the client and agency can work, can flesh out ideas in idea boards. And that's actually something a number of our clients use Hightail for, is to put different inspirational content, reference work, et cetera, into a Hightail space and provide feedback on that, say which they like, which they don't like, what elements of the work is inspiring. This is a super helpful part of the early stage of a project to help make sure that the client and agency are really speaking the same language and set out on the idea that they want to execute in lockstep. So a second critical area is the structure of the creative team that's working on the project. And this is often something that can be a little bit implied or a little bit assumed, and not a lot of thought given to how you structure the creative team across both internally and externally, across the extended organization. On the client side, I think it is critical to think of your marketing team as being extensible, to really pull people that you rely on into the project and think of them as an extension of your regular organization. So we work oftentimes very closely with agencies and almost don't even think of them as agencies. They become really part of our team. And while we might bring them in as needed based on the project that we're working on, we like to forge very close relationships with the outside consultants, freelancers, and agencies that we hire. On the agency side, I think an important element is that the structure of the team be non-hierarchical. And by this I mean, oftentimes I think agencies can be a little bit guilty of allowing everything to sort of go through the principal person, especially this can happen in smaller agencies, boutique agencies. But it's really important that everybody on the agency side feel like they've got a voice, feel like they can express their opinions, and you might want to, think about how those opinions are filtered back to the client, but even express those directly to the client. This is really oftentimes why the clients brought you in the first place, and so having a non-hierarchical structure is really important. And then together, the client and the agency oftentimes need to be more risk tolerant. I think that frequently what results in, I'll call it uninspired work, is reticence to try something new, reticence to stray from what might be conventional in your industry. And I think that the best creative work often stems from a willingness to take risks, a willingness to try new things, and that requires an organizational structure that is non-hierarchical, but also doesn't have, people don't fear repercussions if they suggest a out-of-the-box idea or try something out of the box that fails. They have to be tolerant of those possibilities in order to get the best stuff. All right, so just like in the opening, we talked about miscommunication being a problem. Effective communication is obviously an important area, and the next one we're going to focus on here. For communication, I think on the client side, one of the real challenges is that the client can often lose context on the project. And this is particularly true sort of the higher up you get within the organization. A CMO could have 50 different projects in flight at any given time, and they're jumping from project to project and asset to asset, and they might even forget what they said during the last round of review. So keeping that communication always in context so that the whole team of reviewers and approvers sees the asset in its most recent instantiation, knows exactly what is being discussed, that makes that communication much more effective, much more efficient. Flipping to the agency side, I feel it's imperative that communication be closed loop. And by this I mean that the agency circles back on all the feedback and comments that have been provided and basically says, what are we going to do with these? I think a real frustrating element for a client can be if they feel like they're providing feedback that they just don't see getting incorporated into the work. And that might be the right decision. It might be the appropriate decision for the sake of the integrity of the work, but it's important that that be communicated back to the client in a closed-loop fashion so that the client knows and understands what feedback is going to be incorporated and what's not. I think that's a really important part of the communication process. And then, of course, together, it's imperative that communication be transparent, that both sides are candid with each other, that they see what communication is being provided, that communication from different participants in the creative team isn't being stifled, stymied, pushed to the side. That feedback needs to be open and transparent for the full team. All right, so the next fourth of our 5 areas here that we're going to delve into is feedback. And feedback is a really emotional part of the client-agency relationship. I think it's oftentimes a moment that on the agency side can feel very vulnerable. Work that you've been putting your heart and soul into is being shared with the client sometimes for the first time. And it can be emotionally, challenging to receive that feedback. And likewise, on the client side, it can be really a pitfall if you're not clear about what feedback that you're giving and articulating that really cogently to the agency. So tips on making feedback more effective. On the client side, one of the things that I often, being myself in the role of a reviewer or approver, I try to make my feedback really directed. Just like on the creative side, you sometimes are guilty of saying, hey, here's my content, what do you think? On the client side, the challenge is oftentimes, I just don't like it. Well, what don't you like? I don't know. I can't put my finger on it. That's really unhelpful feedback, obviously, for the agency or for any creative team doing the work. And making sure that your feedback is really directed, really specific, is much more helpful. It can help the agency understand the underlying reasons for the feedback that you're providing, and maybe even come up with more creative alternatives or solutions to the problem at hand. On the agency side, I think it's important that feedback be discretionary, and this is always a little bit hard for me to say as somebody who oftentimes is a reviewer or approver, but I think it's important that creative control really ultimately rests with one person, and if you're bringing on an agency to lead a creative project, they need a certain amount of discretion about what feedback they're going to incorporate it and what they aren't, and from whom they aren't. And this can be hard. This can be a moment in projects where feelings are stressed or strained, but it oftentimes just results in an ineffective mishmash down the line if there isn't sort of a creative vision or creative control with a hand on the throttle. And then, of course, feedback needs to be candid. It's always important that, on both sides of the equation, that if you think something, you need to say something. And I think oftentimes small disconnects can become big ones if that feedback isn't provided in a candid, truthful, honest way. It should also be respectful, of course, and not be something that exacerbates hurt feelings, but you need to be honest on both sides of the relationship. And then the fifth and final area that we'll delve into is the tools for managing the creative process, managing this creative collaboration across the extended organization. And here, too, I think there's some tips for both the client side and the agency side that can make the tools that you use more effective. On the client side, the tools need to be accessible, not only within your organization and including potentially infrequent users of the software tools that you might be using, but outside your organization as well. You need to be able to bring in these third-party teams into your system, and this can be a hard one for IT organizations to get their head around. A lot of times, as I showed in my opening slide, the IT department will assume everybody in our domain and only people behind our firewall need access to this data. We've got to protect its confidentiality. The reality, of course, is you've got to share data with outside parties, especially if you're in a marketing department. And so making sure that your software tools are accessible to everybody who needs them is imperative. On the agency side, it's critical that your software tools be intuitive. A huge point of frustration with a lot of agencies who select Hightail is they want a system like Hightail that allows them to easily share things with their client. They don't need to register. They don't need to sign up for anything. They can just share it out, get feedback, get reviews, get approvals, and they don't need to explain anything or train, heaven forbid, their client on how to use that software tool. And then both sides together, it's important that the tools that they use be consolidated. If you've got your agency using one system and your client using another system, you've created a fault line over which it can be difficult to make sure that you've got good communication, good collaboration. So having something that can support both sides, both the agency side and the client side, in a consolidated fashion is really important as well. So, we recognize, certainly at Hightail, we study this, we do this ourselves as a marketing department, that collaboration around creative content is very hard across all the different parties that are involved in a creative project. There's the individual creatives and designers and photographers themselves. There's their managers, both on the agency side and on the client side. There's a wide range of stakeholders from the CMO to the other execs. And getting creative through every part of the feedback, approval, review process can be really tricky. And that's really what we developed Hightail to do. Those of you who are familiar with Hightail may think of us as a way to share large files, and that's certainly something that we do better than anybody else. But sharing that file is really just one part of the overall collaboration process. And the new Hightail enables you to not only share a file, but get comments on it, get feedback on it, set comments as being requiring a resolution so that you can assign next steps and tasks to different people on your team, managing all the versions of that project as it goes from concept to completion, managing the review and approval and presentation of that content with easy previews and streaming of video and audio assets. And then managing the approval process, so letting the team see who's approved, directing those approvals to the specific stakeholders who have to sign off for a project to be done. All that can be done in Hightail, and it provides our clients a really easy way to keep both their client side and agency side together. And in fact, a lot of Hightail clients started off on one side or the other, either as an agency or as a brand, and then we ended up working with the other side of that equation as well, extending to their customers. So that is a little bit on Hightail, and with that, we're going to go ahead. I'll pass it back to Stuart for some questions.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and really interesting presentation. There's so many issues that brands and agencies face as they go and try to do these things. If you have a question for Mike from today's presentation, please, we've got a number of them right now in the queue, but please use the Q&A widget down there on the bottom of your screen, and we're going to get to as many questions as we can. I also want to give a couple quick reminders to the audience. We had people asking for a copy of today's slide deck, and you'll find that in the resource list, which is down there on the bottom of your screen. It's the green button on the widget bar. So please feel free to download that, share it with your colleagues. Certainly want to get some of those tips. If you would like to invite a colleague to hear the on-demand version, we did record today's webinar, so it will be available on demand in about 2 hours. So please feel free to share that with your colleagues. And if you've enjoyed today's Adweek webinar and you're interested in some of the other ones that we have, please follow us on Twitter at AW Webinars. You'll see that on the left side of your screen. Or check out the Adweek webinar calendar, www.adweek.com/webinars. Let's hop on over to some of these questions here. Mike, a lot of questions coming in from agencies and a number coming in from brands. One of the questions here, and this is from an agency, is asking, how do you avoid creative review by committee, right, where you get sort of a lot of different directions. You get 4 people sending things in, and one says, love this. The next person has a big text through it. So what do you do to avoid some of those things?
That's really important. I think that the first step of avoiding review by committee is getting some consensus on both sides of who is even involved in the review process. Where I've seen that really that the review process kind of go off the rails is when that's ambiguous, when a project starts up. And I think it's an important question to ask on the client side early in the project, who needs to see this? At what stage should we loop in these different stakeholders? So I think that's really, really important. I think another thing that is critical, and this is more problem avoidance than when you get into the throes of an actual review by committee, but is to really try to establish early involvement from those reviewers. In other words, where I see these go awry is if somebody hasn't been involved in the project at all up until late in the process, and they say, we should get Joe's review on this. And it lands in Joe's lap. He has no idea what it is or why it's done, and is expected to sort of rubber stamp it. And that can really send things off the rails. Whereas if Joe was involved early on, even just as an FYI of where the project's going, it can be much more helpful for getting a quick approval late in the process. One other element I think can be helpful is to really distinguish between review and approval. And by that I mean, there are people who you might want to show a creative work to, but be clear if it's more of an FYI versus them having, a trump card to slow things down or get another round of revisions. That's an important distinction, I think, to make as well. And, I think it's just always important on the client side to clarify who those people are, what those roles are going to be, frankly, both within the agency and at the client.
Okay, got another question here in from the agency. get a few in from the client side too, and we'll get those in a minute. But this is someone talking about sort of asking, how do you position the agency as an extension or a partner to the client, right? We always see agencies that want to be there very, very much involved, and then they're saying, this is coming from someone who's a member of actually a pretty well-known agency, and they always want to put themselves in that position, but they feel very often that the clients want to, sort of keep them at bay a little bit, keep them a little bit at a distance. So how do they become really more intimately involved as that agency is an extension of the brand?
That's a great question. I think, making sure that the agency, if you're on this question was asked by somebody on the agency side, so making your agency an extension of the client, to me it really boils down to any professional relationship, which is establishing trust between the two sides. And one of the things that I've frequently seen agencies do that I think can actually starts with good intentions but can ultimately erode trust is what I describe as don't look at the man behind the curtain kind of syndrome, where the agency feels like it needs to be so buttoned up in their presentation of content to the client that the client is kind of left talking to an account rep or a senior exec within the agency, and you don't really know who's pulling the levers and who's doing the work behind the scenes. And I think that what that causes is a similar reaction on the client side, is they kind of put their guard up and they think, well, I don't know, who's actually steering the ship behind the scenes. I don't know who I'm going to offend or who I should direct my comments at. So I think that can be a real challenge if agencies feel like everything has to go through one person, one mouthpiece. The successful agency relationships I've had where we really have treated them like an extension of our organization is when I know exactly who's working on our project. It's not been punted off to some junior person. The 2, 3, 4 people that we're talking to on a day-to-day basis are the ones doing the work, the ones that are knee-deep in it. And I think that kind of relationship really builds that trust and confidence and makes it, again, more of an extension of the client.
Okay. Another one actually coming in here, I think is more from the agency side, but it was actually on one of the tips that you were giving earlier, Mike, and they were asking whether you could talk a little bit about the difference between the client-sided directed feedback versus the prescriptive feedback. Then they're saying it seems sort of a fine line between the two, and how do you sort of navigate that?
That's a great question, and that's a great distinction. I like that, between directed and prescriptive. So the reason I use directed is I think it's important to be specific about what it is you're pointing out or critiquing within the project. Prescriptive is, well, what are you going to do about it, right? So and I try to make that distinction. There will occasionally be times when my feedback is prescriptive, and I think it's important, if you feel compelled to do that as a client, to specify why that is. There may be very valid reasons for that, legal reasons or whatever, that the agency may not have visibility to, so that is important. But more often than not, I think it's better to just be directed and to say, this part of the creative or this part of the campaign isn't working for me for these reasons, and then allow the prescription to be filled by the agency or the creative team. Let them grapple with the problem and then come up with, oftentimes, maybe more creative ideas than what you could come up with on your own to solve that problem, rather than being prescriptive and saying, hey, change this from blue to green. That usually results in more diluted work and can really compromise the creative integrity of the project.
Okay, a couple quick reminders to the audience. We've got a bunch of questions queued up, but if you have a question for Mike about keeping the love alive between brand and an agency, whether you're from the brand side or the agency side, please just ask it using the Q&A widget. We're going to get to a few more here. Mike, a question came in here, and I thought this one was pretty interesting. And they're talking about crisis meetings, right? When that relationship between the brand and the agency begins to become a bit strained. And they're saying asking whether you've ever had those, and how do you recommend approaching that kind of a meeting? I guess this is sort of the last moment where you want to repair everything when there's a little bit of stress between the two. And I guess the other thing, we can talk about approaching it, but I would also maybe ask that you also address ways of avoiding it, right? How you avoid getting to that point where it's gotten so strained.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that avoidance is certainly the best medicine, but if the groundwork hasn't been laid for that, and this question might be being asked by somebody who's facing just such a meeting, I think it has to start with a little bit of I sort of call it a come to Jesus. I think both sides, it's important to be really introspective about what have we done well, what have we done poorly, what can we improve upon, and most importantly, obviously, I think it's important to be solution oriented in those conversations. Very frequently, I think they can feel like a little bit of a blame game, and I think. Speaking, I'm more often the client than the agency in my recent career, and I think speaking on the client side, I'm not really so interested in the reasons why something got off track. I'm more focused on the solution and how to get things back on track. And so I think if you can come into that meeting with some good creative ideas for what to do next, that really sets things up well and can lead to a much more productive conversation.
See a question that's come in here. It's probably a little bit process-based, so we can address that as you've been talking about these things. And this is someone asking about suggestions for how, as an agency, you can encourage your brands and clients to follow some of the client guidelines that you've outlined. Right? You sort of start off and you create a process document for your clients. You want them to follow certain things. You've really described that. Ultimately, to find that when it comes to getting the feedback or the review, that nobody seems to notice any of that anymore. How do you encourage them to take risks or elicit the directed feedback, et cetera?
Yeah, I think the project milestones and an overall project plan, I think, is very important. I certainly agree that sometimes the best laid plans get thrown out of the window when they face reality. But I think the short answer that I'd give there is that, I'll speak from experience. I think that the times when project plans have really gone off the rails is either they are kind of written up and then buried, and you never see them again as a client. And so I think having a good reference document that the client can always go back to. Ideally, it's not just shared via email, but it's online someplace in a Google Doc or something, can be really helpful. Doing checkpoints against that. So at every stage in the process, if you, again, just as an agency, if you just leave that project plan to the side and never look at it again, the client doesn't really have in their mind how the project's progressing. So I think it's important to kind of come back to it in your meetings and in your checkpoints and say, hey, we did this, we did that, next step is this and that. So that's really useful. I've also seen sort of the opposite challenge where sometimes a project plan can be so detailed in such excruciating, 2-point font that it can feel a little academic almost, and too hard to follow, I think, for the client. Again, keep in mind that your client's going to be jumping from project to project, even agency to agency, and so having a simple plan that's easy to understand is really important. And then as you progress through the project, it's always critical that the client kind of understand the trade-offs of different decisions, right? They might give you slightly different feedback if they understand that necessitates a new round on the deliverable, which could delay things by a week. That might be a complete non-starter for them, in which case they might be willing to compromise on some of their feedback, or that could be no big deal and a slip that they're glad to take in order to get the project more on tune with what they're looking for. So, those are just a few thoughts of how to make that work better.
Another sort of interesting question that just came in here, asking about 360-degree agency client assessments. That sounds a little jargony, but I think I guess this is the situation where you have the brand and they get an assessment about the agency and ask them to fill that out, and the agency gets questions about the client and they fill that out. What do you think of those sorts of assessments? Is that productive, or again, is this another of those things that we're very sort of into the process of it as opposed to the results of it all?
I'm not a huge fan of those. I think that it's back to the point about transparency. I think oftentimes a quote-unquote 360 review is done when one of the two parties, or both usually, feel like it's a dysfunctional relationship. And more importantly, I think, it depends on the nature of the review. Some 360 reviews have names on them and some are anonymous. And I think that the anonymous ones can be a little bit insidious. I think that what that suggests is that one party or the other, or people within the client side or agency side, feel like they can't speak their mind and feel like they can't have that conversation directly, and that they have to instead sort of do it through an intermediated vehicle. I wouldn't say that they can't work or that they can't be effective. We actually at Hightail, we do anonymous feedback with our employees all the time to try and just make sure that there is a forum for people who might be uncomfortable speaking their mind, that they can do that. And so it can be a useful tool in certain scenarios, but I think if it substitutes for good, healthy, transparent, honest feedback and discussion from both directions, then you might be making the problem worse.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at the clock, but I think we've got time for one more question. I just kind of want to remind the audience, if you do have a question and we don't get to it, please ask it now anyway. I'm going to make sure that we forward everything over to Mike, and so he'll have a chance to get back to you offline if there's something to cover that we haven't already touched on here. This one, Mike, is about dealing with, I guess, where you get the input from people who you don't want the input from, right? So this is someone asking about how you manage people who probably didn't have any input into the creative process but are too senior in the business to miss out. So, it's the person who may not necessarily understand the direction. And I know you were talking at the beginning sort of about creative briefs. I would think that that's sort of a key here, and also managing the expectations, what you expect from each party. But how do you do that? I mean, that's probably often the person who's controlling the purse strings, but may not even be a part of things day to day, or might not necessarily even be the creative person, and is looking to sort of judge the creative. Again, sort of constant questions going on here.
Yeah, no, that's another great question. I think, I use a phrase, get their fingerprints on the gun early. Like if where that's really been a problem in projects that I've worked on, is when that stakeholder, that key, purse string holder, hasn't been involved early enough. And I think that both for an internal marketing team and even more so for an agency, there can kind of be this natural instinct of, I don't want to show my work to, the C-level person because it's not good enough, it's not polished enough, it's not baked enough. I don't want to show them, kind of harebrained ideas. And that I'd encourage on the agency side, especially, to fight that instinct. I think that it can really build trust and mutual respect to kind of spitball things, look at stuff early, get their ideas and involvement on things, because if a C-level reviewer only sees things at the end and they may disagree with some of the fundamental assumptions on which the project was based at the beginning, then both sides are really in a predicament. The C-level person is faced with either approving something that they don't think is on target or is very good or was ill-conceived or whatever, or they face the decision of sort of scuttling things and sending it back to the drawing board. And neither of those is a very good place to be. And so by contrast, I know when I'm the person providing a final sign-off on something, if I can see kind of the creative direction early on and then revisit it at key points depending on how long the project goes, key points along the way, then I've got all that context when I'm being asked for final review or approval of why are we doing it? How did we come up with this idea? What did it go along the way? What feedback was incorporated? Looks great. And those are the ones where it's easy to just sign off and set the ship to sail.
All right. Well, Mike, I think that's about the time we've got for Q&A now. Just a couple quick things to the audience. Again, copy of the slides are in the resource list folder. You'll also find links over to 3 articles that Hightail has presented that sort of extend the conversation that we've been having during this webinar. So again, check out the resource list folder to see all that, along with a link there over to the Hightail website and also one to the Adweek webinar calendar, because if you've enjoyed today's webinar and you want to attend another one, please check out the calendar for a list of those that are upcoming as well as those that are on demand. This webinar as well will be available on demand, and we'll give everyone a notice when that goes live later this afternoon. Finally, please follow us on Twitter at AWWebinars. Find out about what's coming up. Mike, again, thanks for taking time out of your busy day to share your insights here on the brand-agency relationship, and thanks to our audience for taking time to join us today. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing everyone. We look forward to seeing everyone in an upcoming Adweek webinar. Thanks again.